So we are going to go over cognitive control today. Really cool topic that kind of takes into account everything that we've done so far. I know I've said that for the last couple of lectures, but this is one that really kind of defines agency, our feeling of being in control and having some sort of effect on our actions and our emotions and all those kind of things. All right, so today we're going to talk about cognitive control. How the prefrontal cortex is really heavily involved in really integrating all of these things that we've talked about already, and then exerting kind of top-down control over all of those things. And so the beginning, we're going to kind of get into what it's kind of been defined as and what goal-directed behavior actually is. We're going to look at kind of what happens when the prefrontal cortex is damaged. And we'll notice that it's really hard to kind of distinguish whether or not someone does have these types of deficits, because you really have to have really specialized tests. They're actually pretty fine in most cognitive areas, except for a couple kind of salient points. We're going to look at goals in general and how the brain kind of generates them and keeps them on board. And then we're going to look at how those goals are then translated into decisions. And there's a lot that goes into decisions. There's a lot that goes into kind of reward and value and all those kind of things. And it really talks about how irrational we are as human beings because of a lot of those motivating factors. So everything we've talked about so far has been kind of deterministic in a way, I want to say. A lot of what we've talked about is stuff that's just kind of happening on its own. You have this sensory information is hitting your eyes and your ears, and it's going through these processing pathways without much of our input at all. And so today we're going to start looking at this sense of agency that we have, this sense of control that we have over that sensory input, and how we're able to kind of maintain a routine and a goal and pursue things in life. So cognitive control, as far as like the neurocognitive side of things goes, is defined as these physiological processes that kind of take advantage of these perceptions that I was just mentioning. So all of the sensory information that's coming in, these things that we've identified, right? And they use that along with knowledge from our memory, stuff that's been stored by the medial temporal lobe, and then the goals that have been already created and kind of kept online. All of that's used to kind of bias the selection of what we're going to do next and what we're going to think about next. And there's tons of different possibilities. So it's really got to keep all of this complex information online and sort through it and kind of pick what's the most important. So you'll see that it's really important in overriding our habitual responses. So these are things that are kind of stimulus driven. We see something and we kind of automatically act without having any type of goal or anything like that. And cognitive control kind of inhibits those responses. That's kind of linked to when we talked about the action lectures, linked to like the basal ganglia and those like mid-cortical structures. And a lot of this allows us to really act in creative ways. If we're able to bring up all of this information and compare it to one another, we can really combine it in really unique ways, and it can allow us to solve problems in different ways than we ever have before. And this is really, really, really heavily reliant on integration. This was a question on the last test. We'll bring it up again today about working memory. So the frontal cortex is where working memory happens. And working memory is only possible if you're integrating all of the information from these different centers. Yeah. So goal-oriented behavior. So this kind of encapsulates most of the actions that we take. Have some type of goal or some type of motivation. And as we were just kind of hinting at, there's this reliance on coordination from all of these different brain regions that we've talked about, from memory, from these higher processing areas that are identifying things, from the action areas. And not only do you have to coordinate all of these things and relate all of these things to one another, but you have to do so in sort of a temporal way. You have to do so over time. And so that kind of adds this other layer of complexity onto this, because you have to keep these things online. And you have to remember what your goal was. You have to compare that goal to things that you've done before. And so the last component of this is that there's a portion of the frontal cortex that's really, really important for monitoring whether or not we're actually achieving those goals, whether or not the actions that we're taking are in line with what we've decided before that we wanted to accomplish. And this is something that requires that we kind of inhibit, like I said before, these habitual type responses. Let's see 1 second to get some stuff down. And you'll notice as we kind of go through this, the frontal cortex is really big, and there's different portions of the frontal cortex that kind of do different parts of this, whether it's integration or coordination, whether it's the monitoring itself and keeping those goals online. And it's something that's very kind of uniquely human. And the reason I got these 2 pictures up here is because a lot of people, when they think about goals, are kind of thinking about this one on the bottom of this, like, yes, I climbed the mountain. But goals are very, very simple. It could just be like, what do I want to choose out of the vending machine? Do I use a habitual response and just grab the Snickers because that's what I always do? Or do I decide maybe I should buy some healthy chips because I want to lose some weight? That's kind of the cognitive control side of it, right? Inhibiting that kind of habitual need to just want the sugar and deciding that something's more important. All right, so you can go back. Okay. There we go, cool. So this is something that I hinted at. You guys gotta really pay attention to the fact that the prefrontal cortex is very, very large. And what we mean by prefrontal is that it's the part of the frontal cortex that's not involved directly with action. So when we talked about action, we had the primary motor, we had supplementary motor, the premotor, all of these different areas that had this kind of direct influence on how we move and where we move. The premotor cortex is the portion that makes all of these plans, has all of the goals in mind. So just really want you to kind of differentiate it from the motor responses. The reason it's called prefrontal is because it's more anterior. Don't think of pre as like before. This is just kind of an anatomical distinction. And its job, as we've kind of been hinting at, is that it's coordinating all of this processing across all of these different systems in the central nervous system. And it's this really strong link between all of these systems. So it's not necessarily involved directly in action, but it's really heavily linked to the motor regions. It's linked to the perceptual regions that are identifying things and looking at things through memory. It's tied to our limbic regions, so it's kind of seeing how we feel and how that kind of pertains to the goals that we have and changes the goals that we have. And I thought this was a really cool point down here. Almost every single region that we've talked about, every single portion of the brain has influence over the prefrontal cortex, either through a direct projection or just a few synapses away. So this thing is really, really heavily tied into all of these different systems. The ones that it has the strongest connections with are kind of higher processing areas, which we'll kind of get into, but it has kind of indirect connections to everything else. This would have been a cool one to do in the MRI tour, just like highlight some of the frontal lobe and see how much that's connected to. But when you think about it, so some of you guys weren't at the MRI tour, but what we were able to do, we were able to paint a region of the brain and hit go, and this computer system would show us everything that that region was connected to. And it wouldn't be as simple with the frontal lobe, because I could put a little dot right here and say, tell me what this is connected to. It's not going to be connected to everything, because the prefrontal cortex is really big, right? So there's some regions that are connected to these regions and other regions that are connected to here. So overall, this whole big region is connected to everything, but not every little part of it is connected to everything. Cool. I was looking at this picture this morning, and it doesn't have one of the labels that I was kind of hoping that it did. So a lot of researchers have kind of subdivided the prefrontal cortex into 2 different divisions or 2 different systems. And so one of them is this goal-oriented behavioral system. This is the one that's really involved in working memory in general. So kind of keeping task-relevant information online and kind of maintaining it and doing things to it. So this is really heavily involved in the planning portions of things, simulation of what could happen, those kind of things. And the reason I was talking about the picture is because I talked up here about the lateral prefrontal cortex. So lateral would refer to the fact that it's closer to the outside of the brain, right? So lateral prefrontal cortex is something that's going to come up a lot throughout the rest of the lecture. That's one that's really heavily involved in the working memory component of things. Orbital frontal cortex is the one that's not listed here. This region right here, right above the orbits, which are the eyes, is the orbital frontal cortex. And this label, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, you'll notice in a lot of papers, regions of the frontal cortex get named the same thing, even though the researchers aren't talking about the same region. So one researcher will say ventral medial prefrontal cortex and will be talking about this area. Another one will say that and be talking about this area. These labels are not extremely useful when you're looking at function. I want you guys to instead kind of look at it as kind of where they fall in the brain. So you have orbital frontal cortex right above the eyes, lateral prefrontal cortex is the outside. So we have this green region right here. And then the frontal pole is right here at the very tip top. And we'll talk later about how as you move to the front, the brain starts to handle more complex information. And the medial portion, this is where this picture is not the most useful because this is actually tying in a lot of anterior cingulate cortex too. But the medial portion of the frontal lobe is really, really heavily involved in the monitoring process. And this is going to be really, really important when we get into social cognition. This is something that's on when we're not doing anything. And so this is something that's really keeping our goals online, and it's monitoring whether or not what we're doing is in line with those goals. And so it's looking at outcomes, and it's seeing whether or not that outcome was expected or in line with what we wanted to achieve. So the regions that I really want you to tie to these things, I would say LPFC, so lateral prefrontal cortex, is the one that we're going to see a lot with working memory, and medial prefrontal cortex is one we're going to see a lot with kind of monitoring or keeping things online. Cool. Yeah, you can go to the next one. So this is something that is very kind of uniquely mammal. So this is a very new structure in like the phylogenetic terms of things. It's a lot larger in primates, so this is something that kept getting bigger and bigger. And I think that evolution kind of realized that cognitive control can really help get through a lot of complicated type scenarios. And this is kind of an interesting distinction. So if you're looking at the difference between us and some of the great apes, it's not necessarily that we have much bigger of a frontal lobe or a prefrontal cortex, in relatively speaking. I mean, we have a bigger head. But what's really driving, what a lot of researchers think is really driving our ability to be so much more complex than these animals is the fact that there's a lot more white matter, a lot more pronounced white matter that connects our frontal lobe to everything. So that allows us to be a lot more flexible. We can combine a ton more information than some of these lower order mammals or great apes. And this is a really interesting point. When you look at a developing baby, and you guys probably have heard, like, there's a reason why the drinking age is 21. People don't make really good decisions before the frontal lobe is fully developed. And what you'll see is that it's kind of referred to as ontogeny follows phylogeny. So the newer phylogenetic structures actually develop later. And so if this is a newer structure in evolution, it's going to take longer to develop through development. And so that's why we see that the PFC in kids, even into like teenagers, isn't fully put together and wired and formed. And that you can see that like the maturation, their ability to be social changes as they start getting older. Their ability to hold things in working memory gets better as they get older. So something I would take from here is that it's not necessarily the size, but more the connectedness that separates us from the great apes. And that's the reason why kind of infants are not good at a lot of these prefrontal cortex tasks is because it's a newer structure. It takes longer to develop because it develops last. Cool. So we'll jump into some deficits, which are really, really hard. Like if a patient comes in and there's no indication that this person has had any kind of brain damage, it's really hard for the doctor to diagnose this because They don't have any perceptual abnormalities. So if you give them identification tasks, if you give them location tasks, all of these things, all of their perceptual abilities are still completely intact. They can go throughout the world, they can dance, they can play the guitar. There's no kind of deficit in their ability to actually execute the motor plans. And their language is perfectly intact. So this isn't something that has to do with like Brokaw's or Wernicke's area or anything like that. They're talking just fine. They can understand everything that you tell them. And their IQ is completely untouched by this stuff. So cognitively, these people look completely normal. What we start to see, though, as we dig in, it takes really kind of specialized tests, and it also takes other people to tell us whether or not they've changed. Because the people that know you the best are the ones that are going to be able to see these other things. So that was just one last point. I forgot that one was on there too. So their memory is completely fine as well. So no anterograde or retrograde amnesia or anything like that. But what we see with these people is that their personalities kind of start to change. They become more impulsive. They're really easily distracted and kind of apathetic. They don't care about the feelings of other people. This top point is something called preservation. And so a lot of these patients will, even if they find out that they're wrong, they'll continue to say the same thing over and over again. And this is where it really starts to make sense, and where the doctors are able to really start to diagnose, is that they have a really hard time making decisions or putting plans together in general. They have a hard time understanding what the consequences of certain actions are going to be. They lose sense of like social rules. And so you have this complete disregard for social conventions. And so this is Phineas Gage was an example of prefrontal cortex damage. And the big thing that everybody noticed was everybody kept saying he's not Phineas Gage anymore. His personality is completely different. And he had this just really kind of bad social convention after that. He would be very vulgar in these social situations. And he didn't have a lot of insight into him actually being vulgar in these situations. And so these people, what's really interesting is that they're aware of all of this stuff. They're aware that their social situation is deteriorating. So in the moment, they may not be aware that they're being vulgar or something like that, but they start to notice that they're distancing from people, that they're kind of losing touch with their social reality. They have perfectly good cognitive abilities to try to work these things out, to weigh pros and cons of what they should do to make these situations better, but they have this really, really hard time prioritizing those different actions and putting those different actions into organized plans and implementing those plans. And so it seems to be this problem with actually maintaining that goal. And so it's like, I know that something's wrong, but I can't maintain the goal of actually fixing it. And so a lot of their actions are kind of stimulus driven and habitual. There was a story in the book at the beginning of the chapter about this lawyer that went through all of law school and was ready to take the bar, and he had some traumatic experience, ended up with frontal cortex damage, and nobody really knew, but he ended up blowing off the bar exam completely, started doing all of this stuff that his family didn't recognize, and went into a bunch of debt, everything, and his family had kind of written him off at this point of he's just he's not taking any of this into account. He's not weighing the consequences of any of these actions. And then finally, he went to a doctor and he figured out that he had this frontal lobe damage. And it really put a lot of things in perspective, that you may not be in control of a lot of the things that happen to you. A lot of the deficits in your brain structure might be driving a lot of these actions. That's something that's really hard to kind of grapple with the way that our culture has portrayed actions and portrayed the way that we should punish people for their actions and things like that. The person, not long time ago, but there was the sniper in Austin, Texas, that they found that he had a tumor on his amygdala afterwards. And he had written this whole letter, I don't know why my personality is changing or why I'm thinking the things that I am. And it was post-mortem that they found he had this huge tumor that was pushing on parts of his brain. So kind of interesting that we don't have control over a lot of things. This doctor had this whole group of patients that had PFC damage, and he turned them all loose in a grocery store. And he gave them a shopping list and said, go buy all of these things. And not one of the patients was able to finish the shopping list. They got distracted by something on the shelf that looked pretty. They got kind of engaged in social interactions. One of them wouldn't buy soap on the list because it wasn't her favorite soap. Some person grabbed a newspaper and started reading it, got distracted by the newspaper and walked out the door, and the attendant chased them because they didn't pay for it. So there's this, you can't really maintain these social conventions and these social rules and kind of keep track of all of these things. They saw this with monkeys too. So they saw this really big deficit in goal-directed behavior with monkeys, where these monkeys had already been really good at a lot of things. They were able to open doors and things like that. And this one monkey, after having a PFC lesion, would go to grab the door handle to turn it, but would kind of forget why he was grabbing it, and would get distracted by the color of the handle and would look at it. There was another monkey that would always jump up onto this ledge, and he would always do it to kind of call out to the rest of the group and assemble the rest of the group. And then he had a PFC lesion, and he would jump up to the ledge, but then he would forget why he got there. And he'd look around, why did I just do this? And that kind of demonstrates this difference between habitual actions. So this monkey had jumped to this ledge so many times that when he was out in the yard, he saw this ledge, and the ledge kind of triggered, I should jump. And once he jumped, he forgot that there was some type of goal to that the whole reason he was going to the ledge was to kind of organize. And this was these doctors that work with these lesion patients. This part of the textbook is just these doctors that are interacting with these lesion patients just come up with the most bizarre ways to test these things. So first, this doctor put out a hammer, a nail, and a picture by the entrance to the room. And he had this lesion patient that he would meet every couple of days or whatever. And the lesion patient walked into the room, saw that there was a hammer, nails, and a picture, immediately picked them up without even asking and hung up the picture, right? Didn't even think about it. It was that's what that's for. That's what I need to do. So he took it one step further. And the next time the patient came in, he put out a hypodermic needle and then pulled his pants down. And the patient just picked up the needle and put the shot in his butt. Didn't think why is my doctor pulling his pants down? Weird. Anyway, what this demonstrates, what utilization behavior is that a lot of these people with prefrontal cortex damage end up relying on prototypical type uses of things. And it's really hard for them to inhibit that prototypical use. So they know what a hammer and nails are for, and it's hard for them to stop themselves. It's I gotta do that. They know what a hypodermic needle is, and they know what happens when someone pulls their pants down. I guarantee you this wasn't clear to the IRB. Made it into a textbook somehow. But interesting. So this is really tying in again to this idea that there's a difference between habitual type responses and things that are more guided towards outcomes, right? This person didn't ask if the picture needed to be hung up, didn't really kind of consider the fact that there was an outcome that they needed to think about. They just saw something that needed to happen and did it. So this ties into what Logan was just asking about. So there's a lot of researchers that think that addiction is kind of something that involves dysregulation of the frontal cortex. And so they have this no-go task. So they see a series of alternating letters like this or alternating pictures. There's a bunch of stimuli you can use for it. But the idea is you have two different buttons for each letter. So you push one button for X and one button for Y, and this goes really quick. And then all of a sudden, very rarely, you'll have a letter repeat. And when the letter repeats, you're supposed to inhibit your response. And so you've been pushing, and then as soon as that Y comes up, the second Y comes up, you're supposed to stop yourself from pushing. This is really related to, I don't know, when you were a kid and they have you say a bunch of rhyming words and they ask you what a cow makes. You say silk. Never mind. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But you get people in this rhythm, and then they have them do something that they have to inhibit those responses. And so what we found was that cocaine users had a really hard time inhibiting that response. And so when that second Y would pop up, they would continue to hit the button. And what they think that it was this inability to kind of monitor what the goal was in the first place. That's why I have MPFC highlighted here. Because MPFC was what we talked about earlier as being really tied into the monitoring process in general. And what they found in the MRI was that there was a lot lower activation in these cocaine users in their MPFC during the trials that they were supposed to be inhibiting. And so if a healthy control got to this portion, the MPFC lit up and was like, oh, we're not supposed to do this. Inhibit that response. It had the goal in mind that whole time. Does that kind of tie into what you were asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So that kind of ties up what can go wrong with these systems, right? When we have damage to these systems. And something you got to keep in mind is that the frontal cortex is the easiest portion of the brain to damage. We have these bony prominences right above our orbits that are sharp. And if you hit your head, the brain goes right onto those sharp pieces of your skull. So this is something that's very commonly damaged with people that have head trauma. So wear a helmet, please. So we'll talk about goals now. And goals are something that allow us to get better, to achieve things, right? And all of this kind of depends on these goal-oriented actions that are linked to expected reward. And so it requires that we kind of have this causal link between what we're choosing to do and what actually happens because of that, and kind of keeping track of whether or not these outcomes are in line with what we want to do. So this whole process kind of relies on the fact that we maintain the goal. So it's kind of MPFC type stuff. You have ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So kind of ignore, you'll see ventromedial, you see dorsal medial. Focus on the fact that it is the medial prefrontal cortex. The midline prefrontal cortex does a lot of this monitoring of maintaining. We need to focus on information that's relevant. So this kind of ties into the fact that these prefrontal cortex systems are tied into our attention systems, right? And so we have this goal that we're maintaining, and the information from that goal, this was something that we talked about in the attention lecture, is able to modulate these early sensory systems. It's able to boost signals that are related to that goal. So if we see something that's like important to what we want to achieve, then we can boost the signal of that thing and kind of tag it as being important. It'll be recorded better in memory, all these things. I got it. We need to be able to ignore and inhibit irrelevant information. This is something that's a lot kind of less understood. It's harder to see the consequences of this. But attention, it's really easy to see that there's like these boosted signals for things that are important. But there's not necessarily a lot of research talking about like decreased signals for things that aren't important. I think it's more along the lines that we're boosting things that are, and that kind of just follows. And we need to monitor the progress. So not only are we maintaining the goal, but we're keeping it online for a really long time. And we're making sure that we're comparing it to these previous outcomes and making sure that those actions are in line. And a lot of goals are things that are not easily achievable in one step, right? And this is something, if you get into goal planning in general, they tell you to split goals into sub-goals, into things that you can kind of check off and achieve at one point at a time. Very tied to dopamine rushes. A lot of video games these days are designed to have sub-goals, to keep you addicted, to keep the dopamine flowing, because you're seeing that you've achieved an outcome. You had a small goal, and you achieved some type of reward from that small goal, and so it's like, good, we're on board, we're gonna keep going. I really hope my son is not like addicted to the type of video games they make these days. Like, if you look at the biggest tech industries, they keep their kids away from them. It's kind of interesting. Look at what people do, not what they say. So habits, it's kind of the other side of this, right? So habits are things that are not under control of the reward or the outcome. These are things that are just driven by a stimulus. And once you see something, it automatically gets you to do something that you've done over and over and over again. And this can lead to bad habits. It is really well learned association. So like, let's take smoking cigarettes, for example. Let's say that you're someone that smokes a cigarette in the same place every day. You walk outside, back porch, that's where you pull one out and you light it up. If you walk out back to that same porch without having any intention to smoke, you're automatically going to go through this process of wanting to take that out of your pocket, wanting to light up a cigarette. It's a learned association that your body's ready to do because you've been there over and over and over again. Where cognitive control comes in is that we can use it to break those habits, right? And so even though your body is telling you, you see the porch, you see where you're usually smoking or the chair you usually sit in, your hand's automatically going in your pocket, cognitive control is going to shut that down. So if you have this goal of wanting to quit smoking, then you're going to say, nope, don't reach for it. Let's stop that. Let's create a new association with this stuff, and let's move from here. This whole learned association thing really ties into the physiology of things. This is why drug users, heroin users, tend to overdose when they're out of town. Because if they are constantly doing drugs in the same exact spot, as soon as they walk into their room, their body immediately starts to prepare for the drug and starts to prepare to fight it. But when they're out of town and they don't have the signal and they don't see the room, their body doesn't prepare and doesn't create the chemicals to fight it. And the same dose they would have used at home ends up being an overdose because their body hasn't like automatically set up all of that stuff. So really interesting how cognitive control can kind of break those cycles. And all of this ties back into what we talked about in the learning and memory chapters, that this whole region of the brain is what makes working memory possible. And it's this interface between all of these different areas of processing that we've talked about, these high perception areas, the fusiform face area, or portions of the anterior temporal lobe that have identified objects and things like that. It's looking at things that are stored in long-term memory. Make sure my wife's not in labor. All right. And it's tied into all of these action sequences and plans for action. And what a lot of researchers think is going on is that the frontal lobe is keeping this representation online, that the cells themselves are somehow kind of keeping things active so that it can be kind of manipulated and used for other reasons, integrated with other information. So it can be information from long-term memory, it can be information that just came in from either sensory or short-term memory, but it's able to kind of keep all of these things going and keep all of these things online so that they can be kind of flexibly associated with one another. And that's kind of where I get into this maintenance portion, this ability to take that information and do something with it, to integrate it, to make sense of how it's related to our goals and our intentions. And that's what's enabling this goal-directed behavior. So we're able to compare it to all of these different things that we've already tried to achieve and see how it kind of pertains to the outcomes that we're interested in right now. So we're going to get into now kind of some of the, we're going to zoom in a little bit to kind of the microscopic stuff and look at what may be happening at the cellular level that's really driving a lot of this stuff. And so we'll start first with a couple of slides about kind of delayed response, this idea that we're maintaining some type of representation. So they did this study with monkeys where they put these two food bowls in front of them while they were behind these bars or whatever. And they covered up that food while the monkey was watching. So the monkey saw where the food was. And then they dropped this partition. There's a certain delay period. And then they remove the partition and they ask the monkey, or the monkey just kind of chooses which bowl they think the food is in. So this kind of relies on these working memory mechanisms that they have to maintain the location of that bowl the whole time that partition is gone. And what we've seen is that monkeys with PFC lesions do really bad at this. So there's something happening where they're kind of losing track of where it was. It's not being maintained in working memory. That was a stupid question. So, object permanence. You mean to tell me you don't go anywhere when we play peekaboo? Can't wait to do that with my son. Like, that's gonna be so fun. Whoa, where'd you go? Right? And that's very tied to this idea of working memory and keeping these things online, right? Knowing that something is still there when you can't see it anymore. And so infants are really bad at this because the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, hasn't fully developed yet. And so they don't have this really strong working memory. I love that picture. But you got to keep in mind that this is different than association learning, right? And so this same task that we were just talking about, if instead of just putting two white pieces of paper over the bowls, if you pair the food with an actual symbol, and they learn the minus sign is linked to the food, that's a long-term memory process. That's something that's happening in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is binding this symbol to the location of the food. And so this isn't the same as working memory. It's just keeping those things online, because once you make that association, it doesn't need to be kept online anymore. And then once the partition's removed, it's just the memory of that thing and not the fact that it was maintained that whole time. So other animals are able to achieve object permanence that don't have as fully developed of a frontal cortex as we have. You have animals that need to know that a predator is behind a bush. That's not just gone, right? That'd be pretty maladaptive. But the difference is the amount of time we can actually keep that stuff online. And so if that predator stayed behind the bush for a prolonged period of time, for more than a minute or something, then the animal's going to kind of forget that it was there. So we have a lot more flexibility with how complex our prefrontal cortex is. So at the cellular level, what's going on? So they recorded from individual cells while these monkeys were doing these types of delay tasks. And they show that the neurons have sustained activity over the delay period. So what we're seeing over here in this graph is you have some type of a cue, so something that the animal is told that they need to remember, and then you have a certain delay period. And what you notice is that these arrows are when they didn't have to keep it online anymore. So this is the same cell, right? But you have it online for this long in this trial, but then you have it on for this long in this trial. So these cells are maintaining their firing over the entire delay period. It's not, you can't have it, it can't happen indefinitely. There definitely is time limits to this. The cell is going to get fatigued and not be able to fire at that same rate. But this is really cool evidence that these cells themselves, like their main function is to kind of keep things online during that delay period. So a lot of researchers have been kind of split on what's driving this. It could be that the prefrontal cortex cells are actually encoding some type of representation. So we've looked at that when we were looking at object recognition and stuff, where you had a certain cell that would respond to a very specific stimulus. That would be the idea that they're actually encoding specific stimulus features. Or the other explanation could be that instead of these actually encoding some specific stimulus feature, these cells are just keeping the perceptual regions online. That they're maintaining kind of connectivity with the regions that actually do represent those stimulus features. And so we'll go through a couple of studies that kind of look at this in both ways. I don't think this debate has been fully settled yet. So this first one is going to be kind of along the lines that these may actually be encoding actual stimulus features. So yeah, when I first wrote that, I was like, oh man, that's weird. What, where, and what, where cells? It'll make sense. So these monkeys were trained on a working memory task, and they either had to remember what the object was or where the object was. And they recorded from cells in the LPFC, I believe, yeah. So this was in lateral prefrontal cortex, and this is the one that's really tied to working memory. And so you had some cells that they identified were firing to what the stimulus actually was. Some cells were firing to where the stimulus was, but then you had about half of all of the cells were responding in some combination of both. So this was kind of a muddy picture when they really started to look at this. But it was some evidence that these are possibly encoding stimulus features. Really important, though, that these cells in the LPFC were only active if the monkey actually used that information later. So these are very, very tied to whatever the monkey is doing. They're task dependent. And it wasn't necessarily that the cells themselves were responding to a specific object or a specific location, because if task changed, they switched to a new set of stimuli. So they were able to kind of flexibly adjust what they were firing to. I personally think that I lean more towards they're keeping other regions online, and we'll kind of see that in a second. And this kind of gets at that. Like the fact that they're not specific to a very specific stimuli kind of hints at the fact that they may just be tied to those perceptual areas and be keeping those perceptual areas online to be reactivated when they need to be. And a lot of this is driven by these ties that they have to these long-term memory regions. And so this is kind of what I was just hinting at. So you have some type of goal, some type of task, and you have some type of long-term representation that's been stored in these like higher order processing regions that we've talked about before, so back in like the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, and that this is kind of an interface between those two. And a lot of the evidence is the fact that the prefrontal cortex, its most heavy connections are to these higher processing areas. So you have this inferior temporal lobe portion that's really heavily encoding shapes of objects. You have these region in the temporal parietal or temporal occipital area that's really heavily involved in color perception. These portions of the parietal lobe that we've talked about, that aware pathway, they're really heavily tied to location and things like that. And we'll see some evidence on the next slide about this idea here, that it may be keeping these multimodal. So remember, multimodal means that these areas are processing more than one sense. So these are higher processing areas. They're not like primary visual or primary auditory. This is after the information has been really, really heavily processed and compared with information from other senses and things. And so the representations in these areas are a lot more coherent. They're a lot more whole. And so it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to keep primary areas online, because those don't really have as much information as these areas do. And so we have some evidence from MRI that we'll look at. The big idea here is that it's possibly keeping these higher processing regions online because they're related to whatever the goal is. And so they did this study where they had participants, they either showed them 1, 2, or 3 faces, so there were 4 faces. So there was always 4 things on the screen, but they might have scrambled 1 or 2 of them. And they told them to maintain all 4 or however many faces were on the screen at a time. So I want you to remember all of those faces. And then after a certain delay period, they showed them a face and they asked them whether or not that face was in the original set of 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so what they saw was that you had a lot of activity in that lateral prefrontal cortex that was sustained through the entire delay period. So that really links to this, what we just saw on the cellular level, that this area is staying active kind of in that delay period, in the absence of the task. So they're kind of maintaining the memory of all of these things. This was what was kind of interesting. Oh, and this was a good point. So there was greater activation for more faces. So the more things that needed to be kept online kind of ended up creating greater activity in that area that was keeping things online. But this is where it ties into that last point that we were just looking at. So the FFA, which is the fusiform face area, we talked about with prosopagnosia and like people not being able to see faces and things. So this is where faces are really heavily encoded. This is a higher processing area. It was really heavily active during encoding. So when they were looking at faces, you'd expect to see really high fusiform face area activity. That activity dropped off during the delay period while the LPFC was really active. but it didn't drop off all the way to baseline. It was still kind of maintained somewhat. And so it's this idea that the LPFC might have this connection with it, and it's keeping those areas ready to be reactivated if they need to be. So not necessarily that the LPFC is encoding faces or representing faces, rather that it's just keeping that face area online so that when we need to make a decision, that information that's in the face area is still right there and ready to be accessed. NBAC task. So I'm actually doing a study right now that involves the NBAC, and it is not easy. So these subjects, this is a really popular working memory task. And the reason it is because it doesn't require that you just maintain something over the delay period, but that you maintain something that's changing constantly. So the idea is that you're shown this series of stimuli, and you're supposed to respond if a stimulus repeats itself. So in a one-back condition, you're saying, did the letter L happen one letter ago? Right? So this is kind of the easiest form of the task. But as the task gets more difficult, so two-back, did the letter T happen 2 letters ago? Right? And so that wherever you see response, that's a correct response. And so K happened 2 letters ago, S happened 1 letter ago. And so what you have to do is not only maintain and keep these things online, but you have to constantly update that representation. You have to constantly change what it is you're comparing the current stimulus to. And that's kind of what this gets at. And what we see is that the lateral prefrontal cortex, the portion that's really heavily involved in working memory, gets a lot more active as this NBAC task gets more complicated. And I'm going to have you guys do this task on the next slide. You'll see how tricky it is. So what we just talked about is a 1-back and a 2-back. So the idea, what I want you guys to do, I'm going to show you a series of letters, and I want you guys to write down the letter on your piece of paper or whatever you have if it fits the right criteria. So we're going to do a 4-back task, right? This just kind of demonstrates how difficult this can be. So what I want you to do is you need to maintain the order of these letters, and you need to respond if a letter is repeated the same as it was 4 ago. Does that make sense? Okay. 4-back task. And then at the end, let's see what letters you guys have written down. Ready? There's about 14 of them. So, and it's about a second per letter. So just make sure you're maintaining the whole sequence and that you're writing down a letter if it happened 4 letters ago. All right. What letters do you guys got? B. Okay. B is definitely it. X is the other one. Yeah, so there were 2 letters in there. It was B and X. Something that I noticed when I was doing this task is that as soon as you make a response, you lose the whole sequence. Yeah. And it demonstrates a lot, right? Because they're separate systems. So as soon as you move away from the working memory system, it stops. Really kind of interesting. There's a lot of versions of this online. 3-back is actually a bit easier than this. Once you get to 4 or 5, it's freaking crazy. I'm doing a location-based one in the study that I'm doing, and it's really hard. Cool. So what a lot of researchers have started to notice is that there's kind of this posterior-anterior gradient that falls along with difficulty. And so things that are simple, like the 1-back task, tends to activate regions that are more posterior in the frontal cortex. And so this would be really simple rules. So push the left button for flower and the right button for car, something like that. Really simple rules, kind of only engage these posterior regions. But now let's say that instead of it being just like left for flower and right for car, that it has to do with the color of the border around the object. As the rules become more complex, we start to see that activation moves more anteriorly. And then when you start to have something where the rules are updated and changed from one block to the next, and it's continuously getting more complex, that we start to see the activations moving really far forward towards like the frontal pole area, in front of the frontal cortex. So it's this idea that, and when you really look at it, you look at the phylogeny of this, right? The fact that these brain regions have evolved in kind of a linear type way. The more anterior regions, the regions that are handling more complex information, are regions that evolved later. I don't know if we'll get through the whole lecture, but we'll start to talk about some decision making, right? So kind of we've looked at how we maintain goals, how we create goals, and things like that. But you have to eventually make a decision about that goal and kind of take a stance, right? And there's this whole field called neuroeconomics. It's a really new field, and it's the kind of cognitive side of decision making. So economists have been studying decision making for a really long time. And neuroeconomics is trying to add this kind of biological layer to it, like what's going on in the brain while we are making those decisions. And the economists gave them a lot of flack when this first came out. They're like, why are we going to spend $500 an hour sticking someone to an MRI if we can just ask them what they like and what they want to choose? Decision making seems like it's a really easy thing to test behaviorally, right? We don't need to put someone in a scanner and look at their brain. And then Brian Knudsen came along and found something really cool. He just gave a talk at UO this last year. Really cool. So this study is not in the textbook. It was one that I thought kind of explained this idea. I did move a slide, so they might be in a different order. You guys see it. That'll be in a couple of slides. But they did this MRI study where, so the researchers had a bunch of these projects that were going out to be crowdfunded. So this like new idea of putting a project out there and a bunch of people throw money at it, it's either successful or not. They had a bunch of data on these projects, and they had data on which ones were successful and which ones weren't. And they showed all of these projects to subjects while they were in the scanner, and they had the subjects making decisions about whether they would fund that project. And they had this kind of fake set of money that they were dealing with. And they scanned them while they were making all of these decisions. And the researchers then later kind of compared the behavioral responses, so what the subjects actually said that they would fund or not, and the brain responses, so what was happening when they were making those decisions. And they compared that to which projects were actually successful in the end. And what they found was that there was this signal from the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is really heavily tied to kind of reward type processing. And this signal in the nucleus accumbens predicted which ones would be funded kind of at the macro scale above and beyond what they were actually choosing. So even if they said, I'm not going to fund this, there was a signal in their brain that says, but everybody else is. And it's really interesting. Like Brian Knudsen talks a lot about how there are some people that are better at this than others. He's like in his talk had a picture of the precogs from Minority Report. Like we need to find the people that can predict market outcomes. This is a very like burgeoning, lucrative field. Yeah. Yep. And there was this signal in the nucleus accumbens that predicted the whole macro, like how well they actually did, even if the person had said that they didn't like it. So it was this idea because the economists had given them flack. They were like, why would we put them in the scanner if we can just ask them what they like? This is saying there's something in the brain that shows what the population likes that's not seen in their individual choices. Yeah. And then they kind of compared that to their preferences and things like that and made a different behavioral decision. And the nucleus accumbens is kind of a cortical structure, or a subcortical structure. So it's kind of an older structure. So it's making kind of immediate reward decisions. And so there's a lot more to the actual decision that they made, but they were able to pick up on these signals kind of early on. So Interesting idea. There's still a lot of flack that these people get. They think that they're wasting a bunch of money scanning people, but I think this is a really cool step in the right direction. Economists in general have been really kind of tricked by the way that humans actually act. So there's a bunch of economists early on that created all of these models about how perfect economies should look, and mathematicians did the same thing. And then they were like, but nobody's doing it. People aren't making rational decisions, things that actually make sense. Like the economy should work like this, but it's not. Like why would someone pay a bunch of money for tuition and then skip classes? Why would someone pay a bunch of money for insurance on their car, but then text while driving? It's not logical. Humans aren't logical. And a lot of that is because what we do is driven by these evolutionary processes. A lot of our decision making was created at a time when we were like hunter-gatherers. This is something we talked about kind of in the first couple of lectures. Our brain didn't evolve in the modern world with cars and cell phones and donuts and all that kind of stuff. Like a person back then would never skip the opportunity to eat a jelly donut, right? It's like full of sugar and resources and all of these things, right? And they wouldn't exercise to burn off fat stores because they needed those fat stores in case they didn't have food later on. There are a lot of these processes that are driving our behavior that are kind of under the hood, that kind of add up to the fact that we make really illogical decisions, irrational decisions. And researchers have kind of chunked these different types of decisions and motivations into these two categories. So we have primary enforcers of decisions. These things are the really, really heavily kind of encoded stuff. There's a lot of evidence that there's stuff in our genetic code that drives some of these behaviors. They've seen this in like worms even. There's like genetic code that like kind of predicts what the worm is going to choose to do next. And then secondary reinforcers are things that don't have any value themselves. It's something that we've given value to, something that we've added kind of an association to and another layer to. And so our decisions as humans are a lot more complex because we have this other layer that's kind of modulating these evolutionary drives. And I think I might be able to get through maybe a couple more slides. So sorry if I'm speeding you up at all. So I'm going to put these up real quick. I want to go through just the next study real quick before I let you guys out. This is just an idea that value is something that these neuroeconomists are really interested in. But value is a really complex idea, right? There's part of it that's linked to the payoff. So what kind of reward am I going to get for this action that I'm taking? There's part of value that's linked to the probability. So even though the lottery pays out a lot, what's the chance that I'm actually going to get it? There's a part of it about how much energy I actually have to expend to be able to achieve that reward. There's all of the situational factors, how I feel and what kind of things are pressing right now. And then your preferences that have to do with things that were good in your past, associations that you've already built up. The idea here, I don't want you guys to remember all of these. That's not the point. I just want you to know that value itself is complex. The reason that we're so inconsistent from one choice to another is because value is a combination of all of these things. And they've shown that there are different regions, this is what I'll end with, that are involved with the different components of value. So they recorded in these 3 different regions with monkeys while they were doing decision-making tasks that had some type of reward or something that came out of it. And they were looking specifically at these 3 different portions of value: payoff, probability, and cost. So the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, was active for all 3. So it was this idea that is kind of representing value as a whole. The LPFC, which is really heavily involved in working memory, was active for probability. And that kind of makes sense when you look at the role of working memory and the fact that it's integrating different situational factors and considering all of these different options and bringing things online. And then the orbital frontal cortex was really heavily active for the payoff. and the reward. And something I won't have time to get into is that like this region has been studied a lot, the OFC with reward. If you put an electrode in a rat's brain and you give them the control over whether or not they push it, and it's in the OFC, they will keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. They will not eat. They'll just keep getting that kind of inherent reward, or it feels like they're getting a reward because they're activating this kind of reward region. And the OFC is really heavily tied into the nucleus accumbens that we were just talking about. So this is kind of like the higher perceptual layer of reward. So that's where I will end today.